What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of At a Glance, a series in which I give you an appetizer, sampler, glimpse into a particular faction in 40k. And the goal of it is to help you decide if you want to look further into that faction on your own, or maybe even start collecting that force. So, with that said, up on the chopping block this time for an appetizer, sampler, glimpse into it, by viewer request, is the Carcharodons Astra Space Marine chapter, more commonly called the Carcharodons. I did a fluff ramble on them where I go into a bit more detail on their fluff and their style and everything. So check that out if you want to know a bit more, or at least get my opinions and some information on them in a bit more detail. But even though I won't be going into as much detail, I'll be doing a more full encompassing look at them, not just their fluff and their origin and their color scheme, but also collecting them a bit and whatnot. So with that said, the Carcharodons are essentially retcon space sharks. There used to be a chapter called the Space Sharks. In some people's eyes, they still exist and the Carcharodons don't. But let's be honest, the Space Sharks was the chapter that used to be referenced as showing up to assist the Imperial forces in the Badab War, and now it's this chapter called the Carcharodons doing the same exact thing, and their symbol is a shark, and yada yada yada. They are a retcon Space Sharks chapter. So, the Carcharodons are of an undetermined founding and an undetermined descent. However, popular opinion slash assumptions based on the fluff we have present from the Badab War book and from the Horus Heresy series from Forge World is that they are of Raven Guard descent from this force that was sent away by the Primarch to assist this fleet, basically a rogue trader type exploratory fleet that was just going to go out and pierce the stars essentially and bring the Imperium even further beyond the boundaries that it currently had at that time, the fledgling Imperium. And it consisted of particularly bloodthirsty Raven Guard members before they became the Raven Guard official. So they still had their unification color scheme, which was a series of grays and all that, which we'll get into a little bit later by talking about the Carcharodons color scheme. But and the fluff kind of sets up that the Primarch did this deliberately to kind of get rid of them, if you will, in terms of they didn't fit with the way he was restructuring his legion, but they were still useful for things. And it wasn't the entirety of legionnaires like that. It was just a chunk of them. So that is what is thought to be the actual founding of the Carcharodons, that they just became the Carcharodons over time. And then once they popped their head back into the Imperium here and there, they were ratified into being as a official Space Marine chapter. Just nobody knew when they were founded because, well, didn't really happen. That's my big theory on them and kind of the more widely accepted theory on the Carcharodons founding. It's heavily implied to be of Raven Guard descent, and I feel that's how it's implied to be when they were founded. Now, really the two things I want to touch upon here real quick, again, this is just an appetizer, sampler, glimpse, we're just skipping along the surface here. Like I said, I did a fluff ramble on them where I go into a bit more detail on rambling about the Carcharodons, and I did that video a while ago, so you can check that out. But two things really keep in mind. They are a nomad, if I can speak properly, a nomad predation fleet type of chapter, meaning they're completely self-sufficient. Their fleet assets, their tactics, their armory, their ways of doing things are all designed for complete and utter self-reliance, because they were fighting solo. They've always been on their own without any support from the Imperium. That was their charge, that was their purpose. So in order to succeed, they adopted the nomad predation style of doing things, from their fleet to their tactics and everything. So everything's kind of built up on that foundation. Secondly, they're incredibly dark and brutal of a chapter. They're mysterious, which adds to kind of this dark allure of them. And by dark, I don't mean evil, I mean brutal. A very brutal, bloodthirsty chapter. Not so much bloodthirsty, that's actually an error for me to say, because they're not berserkers, or berserk-like really, but they're very brutal. Put it to you that way. This is a chapter that, in order to fully break the back of the Astral Claws, when they were assaulting the Palace of Thorns, the Carcharodons were tasked with crushing all other resistance outside the Palace of Thorns, so they just slaughtered the hive cities that they went into, and, as it turns out, overloaded the nuclear reactors, thus ripping the surface of the planet apart, and ultimately crushing the resistance, sure, but also resulted in a mass panicked exodus off the planet of friend and foe alike. They have a very quick approach, a very simple yet brutally effective approach to how they fight. And it boils down to two things. You either with the Imperium or you're an enemy. Those are the two things. I know it's really type of one thing, but there's two sides to it, is a better way of putting it. If you're of the Imperium, loyal to the Emperor and the Imperium, they fight alongside you. They offer their assistance. They protect you, essentially. They fight the enemies that would see the Imperium brought low. But if you're not with the Imperium, whether you are a non-combatant, a regular person, whether you're a public figure, or whatever you want to call them, no matter what you are, if you are not of the Imperium, not with the Imperium, then you are an enemy that needs to be crushed utterly and slaughtered. That's how they view it, essentially, when you look at how they fight. So, that is, in a nutshell, the Carcharodons. They are a very black and white type of chapter in that regard. Brutally effective, and the way they do things is set up because they have to be completely self-sufficient. So their marks of armor are kind of cobbled together and salvaged, and sometimes it's not always full-on Mark 7 or full-on Mark 6, whatever, but it's a hodgepodge of maybe Mark 4, Mark 5, and Mark 7 pieces or something like that, just to make use of everything that they have. But that aside, their tactics for fighting are very kind of test the waters. They'll have vanguard forces and scouts deployed to recon and assess the situation, attack the enemy. If the enemy's found to be wanting, essentially if they are able to establish a very distinct and clear advantage in that test hit, then they just surge full on with all their forces into just wiping out the enemy there, pushing through and utterly destroying everything in a very brutal fashion. If, however, they're testing and they feel that the enemy's resistance is too great, it'll be too costly of a battle, they'll withdraw and redeploy, because being completely self-sufficient, a drawn-out war of attrition does not work well for survivability and sustainability of a chapter that has no support at all. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the way they fight is not so much you need to be vanquished or defeated, it's that you need to be exterminated, killed, dismembered, destroyed, dead and buried, dead and burned, whatever it is. That's how they do it. So it's a very brutal way of looking at things. And with that, they have a pretty brutal color scheme, but it's pretty cool. And the reason I call it a brutal color scheme is because it fits in with what they are. And it also harkens back a bit if you have the Forge-Rolled Horus Heresy books, as well as the Imperial Armor Badav War Part 2 book. You'll see that the Raven Guard's pre-unification color scheme and the Carcharodons' current color scheme are similar. The Carcharodons have shades of gray, essentially. They have what I call standard gray, kind of smoky gray, as their main armor color. On their shoulder pad and trim, they have this really dark gray, nearly black, which you can also see on some of their chest emblems, some knee pads, and other accent areas of armor. They have an accent color of gold for certain things, and on the helmet faceplate, they have a really pale gray, near white color going on. And if you look up images of great white sharks, their armor color scheme, in a sense, is reminiscent of how great white sharks look a little bit. Their helmet eye lenses are black. They're not red or blue or green. They're black, so it adds to their brutal look. And what a lot of people like to do, myself included, is give them gore effect on their armor. I don't go too crazy with it because then it gets kind of silly looking, but it does work well considering their fight style and everything, and it just accents them really nicely. At least I think so. With that, you've seen their chapter symbol. Forge World used to make a really cool decal sheet for them, but they stopped selling it for a reason, and I don't know why. But if you're able to maybe see it on eBay and get a hold of it, it's definitely worth your while if you are a Carcharodons fan and want to collect them, as long as it's not too overly priced. But one thing, you can definitely find images of it. And one thing you'll notice is there's some tribal-like markings. They have some shark teeth markings, and then they have some just random tribal accent markings that you can put on the armor, as well as stylized tactical assault, devastator, and veteran markings. It'll be the tactical arrow or the veteran skull, but it's very tribal marking stylized to convey the arrow or the skull, but it's not a solid color. And if you're good at freehanding, you can replicate that and other tribal markings in general on the armor if you want to. So that's the type of scrimshaw markings / actual arrows that they use, but they also just have their chapter symbol on both sides, so they don't need to have the stylized tribal tactical marking or whatever it is. So with that said, any generic Space Marine kit from Forge World or GW will work for them. Unfortunately, there really isn't much in terms of sculpted detail or kits specific to the Carcharodons, so from Forge World or GW, so there is that unfortunate part. But that's still, a lot of stuff to make use of, from the Horus Heresy bits, like Mark 5, Mark 4, Mark 3 armor, to really ornate Vanguard veterans and Stern Guard and stuff from GW. You get a lot of bits to make use of in that regard. When it comes to actually building them, the Space Marine Codex is going to be your codex of choice, and the Raven Guard chapter tactics would probably be the best way to go with them if you're not going to use Forge World rules. Forge World does have chapter tactics that they made up for the Carcharodons, and of course Tabarossa Redwake's rules. And with that said, obviously his model along with it, as you've probably seen. But with that said, they are Forge World stuff. So if you know your local area that you do tournaments in a lot, or events or leagues like Escalation or just other campaign type of league stuff, if you know they don't allow Forge World rules at all, then I recommend Raven Guard chapter tactics from the Space Marine Codex. If they do allow it, you can do the Siege Assault Vanguard army list from the Vidal War books, or you can just utilize the Carcharodons chapter tactics alongside the Space Marine Codex. Whatever works. But that's only if you know your area will allow it for a lot of games. You could always have two lists, one built with the Forge World rules for fun games or Zone Mortalis type games, and then your list for playing in events and leagues and tournaments that doesn't have any Forge World rules in it at all. So that's just some stuff to keep in mind. Anyways, that's it for the Carcharodons. I really like this chapter a lot, to be honest. I think they're a pretty cool chapter, and are definitely worth checking out if you want to play a particularly brutal and effective, stark contrast, black and white way of looking at everything type of chapter. The Carcharodons definitely fit that bill. Anyways, that's it. Thanks for sticking through it, and until next time, take it easy.